Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Chile Project, the story of the Chicago Boys and the downfall of neoliberalism, by Sebastian Edwards, narrated by Andrew Joseph Perez. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and ebook editions of the book. Introduction. In 1955, as the Cold War reached a new peak, the U.S. Department of State launched the Chile Project. The purpose of this program was to train Chilean economists at the University of Chicago, the bastion of capitalist thought and Milton Friedman's academic home. Once they returned to Chile, the young graduates were supposed to tout the principles of free markets in the increasingly ferocious war of ideas that raged in Latin America. Their adversaries in these intellectual battles were leftist economists who believed that the only way to defeat poverty and backwardation was by increasing the role of the state through nationalization, planning, and socialism. In 1961, after Fidel Castro declared that he was a Marxist-Leninist, the Chile Project became an integral part of the U.S. strategy to contain the spread of communism in Latin America. For more than a decade, the Chicago Boys, this was the name the media gave to the young graduates, had very little influence in policy design in Chile. They toiled in academia, trained other economists, wrote newspaper columns and insipid academic papers, and consulted for large banks and firms. But they were not taken seriously. In fact, the establishment looked at them with a combination of derision and amusement. Things changed dramatically on September 11, 1973. When General Augusto Pinochet led a coup d'etat that deposed socialist President Salvador Allende. The military's accession to power gave the Chicago Boys a unique opportunity to apply the theories they had learned from Milton Friedman and his colleagues. For the next 17 years, they had a free hand with which to experiment on the Chilean economy. They freed prices and interest rates, lowered import tariffs, privatized hundreds of state-owned enterprises, instituted school vouchers, created individual savings pension accounts, deregulated businesses and banks, and furthered markets everywhere. They applied a shock treatment to balance the budget and to reduce inflation, reformed labor legislation, contained the power of unions, attracted foreign investors, and strengthened the rule of law. When democracy was reinstated in 1990, the country looked very different from how it had looked in 1973, when President Allende was overthrown by the military. In less than 2 decades, the Chicago Boys had created a modern capitalist economy that, after some sputtering and a deep currency crisis in 1982, produced an acceleration in efficiency, productivity, and growth. In financial and economic circles, there was talk of a budding Chilean miracle. The miracle, however, had an original sin. It was put in place by a dictatorship, a regime that violated human rights and systematically persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, and assassinated its opponents. It was precisely for this reason that most observers were surprised when, after the return to democracy in 1990, the model put together by the Chicago Boys was not scrapped by the country's new leaders, many of whom had been persecuted by Pinochet. Instead of undoing the free market policies, successive left-of-center governments deepened the reforms. To be sure, the new democratic administrations expanded social programs, but the main building blocks of the so-called neoliberal model, a small state, very light regulations, full openness to the rest of the world, restrictions on union activities, very low corporate taxes, voucher-based education and health systems, narrowly targeted social programs, a pension system based on individual savings accounts, and the reliance on markets at every level were expanded. Contrary to what many uninformed critics have proclaimed, the Chicago Boys model was not supported exclusively by the military. It was continued by members of the Partido Demócrata Cristiano, Christian Democratic Party, Partido por la Democracia, Party for Democracy, and Partido Socialista de Chile, Socialist Party of Chile, for over 30 years. After more than a century of mediocre performance, in the early 2000s, Chile became, by a wide margin, the wealthiest nation in Latin America. Around that time, it also attained the best social indicator levels in the region for health, education, and life expectancy. As a result, people living below the poverty line declined from 53% of the population in the mid-1980s to merely 6% in 2017. In terms of income and other economic statistics, by 2020, Chile looked more like a southern European country, such as Portugal or Spain, than a Latin American nation. Notably, when Chile's reforms were first launched, most analysts were skeptical. They considered the market policies championed by the Chicago Boys to be extreme and thought that they would not work in a small and poor Latin American nation. On April 16, 1975, 2 weeks after Milton Friedman met with General Pinochet in Santiago, The Guardian reported that the military was considering embracing some lunatic schemes dreamt up by the Chicago economists. Figures I.1 and I.2, which can be found in the print and ebook versions of this book, summarize some of the most important economic aspects of Chile's story with neoliberalism. Figure I.1 presents the evolution of gross domestic product per capita between 1980 and 2019 for a group of Latin American nations. In the first half of the 1980s, Chile was at the bottom of the pack, jointly with Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Peru. By 2003, and largely as a result of the market reforms initiated by the Chicago Boys and continued by the left-of-center governments, Chile had become the country with the highest income per capita in the region. It maintained the leading position until 2019, when it was surpassed by Panama. Figure I.2 shows that the poverty head count declined from 53% of the population in 1987 to merely 6% in 2017, the lowest in Latin America by a significant margin. As a point of comparison, in 2017, the poverty head count in Costa Rica was 22.5% and 21.5% in Ecuador. After the return of democracy in 1990, Chile was frequently hailed as an example of how to conduct public policy in an emerging or transitional economy. Analysts from around the world and from every political persuasion used adjectives like sensational and inspiring to refer to Chile's development experience. Politicians from countries in the former Soviet sphere traveled to Chile to learn firsthand how to put in place a successful pro-market program, how to open the economy, and how to privatize a massive number of state-owned enterprises. Notwithstanding the rapid rate of growth and the drastic reduction in poverty, inequality remained high throughout the period. In 2022, Chile had the third highest degree of income disparity among the members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a group of high-income countries that Chile joined in 2010. Between 2000 and 2020, progress was made in reducing income differences, but they continued to be very high. Persistent inequality was Chile's Achilles heel, a serious weakness that was mostly ignored by the architects of the model and that would come to haunt them. The struggle for income and wealth distribution is a recurrent theme in the chapters that follow. From the Chilean miracle to the popular revolt of 2019 and the Constitutional Convention. On October 18, 2019, and to the surprise of most observers, massive protests erupted throughout the country. Demonstrations were triggered by a small increase in metro fares, 30 pesos, or the equivalent of 4 cents of a US dollar. But the rallies were about much more than the fare increase. Hundreds of thousands of people marched in several cities and demonstrated against the elites, corporate abuse, greed, for-profit schools, low pensions, segregation, and the neoliberal model. Demonstrators asked for debt forgiveness for students and free universal health services. Protesters carried Mapuche flags and demanded the return of lands taken from indigenous peoples in the 19th century. Although most of the demonstrations were peaceful, some turned violent. There was arson, destruction of public and private property, and looting. More than 20 metro stations were set on fire during the first few days of the protests. The police responded with unjustified force and were accused of multiple human rights violations. After weeks of massive demonstrations, rioting, looting, and arson, on November 15, 2019, the leaders of most political parties, with the important exception of the Partido Comunista de Chile, Communist Party of Chile, and the far-left Frente Amplio, Broad Front, concluded that the only way of controlling violence was by initiating a national conversation on a new social pact. A referendum was called to determine if a new constitution was to be written to replace the 1980 charter, adopted during the Pinochet regime and amended during different democratic administrations. A year later, the process was delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The option of rewriting the Chilean constitution won the referendum by a landslide, and in mid-May 2021, a 155-member constitutional convention was elected. 17 out of the 155 seats were reserved for representatives of the indigenous peoples. According to the rules, for a norm to be included in the new constitutional text, it had to be supported by at least 2/3 of the delegates. Most elected members of the new body belonged to the far left, and many supported specific causes related to social and reproductive rights and environmental protection. They declared that the convention's goal was to write an anti-neoliberal constitution, one that put an end to the Chicago Boys model. They wanted a constitutional charter that granted broad social rights to everyone, recognized and provided compensation to the indigenous peoples for lands taken during the 19th century, and protected sexual minorities and the environment. The conservative forces, the right and center-right, elected 27% of the convention's delegates and thus could not garner the 1/3 required to exercise veto power. In a front-page story published on December 29, 2021, the New York Times noted, "In Chile, a national reinvention is underway. After months of protests over social and environmental grievances, 155 Chileans have been elected to write a new constitution amid what they have declared a climate and ecological emergency." On December 19, 2021, Gabriel Boric, a 35-year-old congressman, former student activist, and member of the coalition Apruebo Dignidad, Approval and Dignity, was elected president by an ample margin. He was supported by the Communist Party and by the Frente Amplio, Broad Front, a coalition of smaller and far-left parties and political movements with names such as Comunes, Commons, Convergencia Social, Social Convergence, Fuerza Común, Common Force, and Revolución Democrática, Democratic Revolution. Most of these collectives, as they liked to call themselves, were born in the early 2010s, during major student demonstrations and protests. In speech after speech during the campaign, Gabriel Boric called for eradicating the neoliberal model, including some of its most distinctive accomplishments, such as the pension system based on private savings accounts. 3 months after Boric was inaugurated as president, the Constitutional Convention finished its work. With great fanfare, a draft was presented to the population on July 4, 2022. A referendum to be held on September 4th would determine, by simple majority, whether the new charter was adopted. There would be 2 months for campaigning for one of two options: apruebo, approval of the future text, or rechazo, rejection of the constitutional draft. The proposed new constitution went well beyond reforming the neoliberal model that had prevailed for 40 years. The text made major changes to the country's political system. It declared that Chile was a plurinational state that consisted of several indigenous nations. It weakened fiscal responsibility and the protection of property rights, and provided ample territorial autonomy to indigenous peoples. The proposal eliminated the Senate and defined a wide range of social rights, 103 in total, including the right of glaciers not to be disturbed. It created several justice systems, one for each of the 11 officially recognized indigenous peoples, and one for the rest of the population. It established that the indigenous peoples would have reserved seats in Congress, and directed the government to focus foreign policy on the Latin American region instead of on the Pacific, as all governments had done since the end of the 20th century. As the referendum date approached, several left-of-center politicians, including former presidents Eduardo Frei Ruiz-Tagle and Ricardo Lagos, criticized the proposed text. The issue, they pointed out, was that the draft did not address the real needs and aspirations of the people. It was an overly partisan proposal, largely inspired by identity politics. The draft did not explain how the provision of social rights would be financed, and there was a danger that the text would become a multitude of unfulfilled promises. A new constitution was needed, they affirmed, but the one drafted by the convention was not adequate. Their position was to reject the proposal and start a new constitutional process all over again. On September 4th, after a fierce and bitter campaign, the Rechazo opposition won by a substantial margin. It got 62% of the votes, while Apruebo garnered only 38%. The vote was a major blow for President Boric, who had campaigned for approving the new text. According to a New York Times article published on September 6th, the transformational vision laid out by a constitutional convention of 154 elected members, many of them political outsiders, proved too drastic an overhaul. On September 5th, The Economist wrote, "Much of the blame for the defeat lies with the convention itself." More than 2/3 of those elected were outside mainstream political parties. They included many political newbies and activists from the hard left. They quickly alienated the average voter. At the time of this writing, in late September 2022, politicians of all persuasions are discussing the next steps in Chile's constitutional saga. Although the timing and details of the new process are not yet known, 3 things are certain. First, Chile will replace the old constitution with a new one that will enshrine and guarantee many social rights that will be provided for free by the state. It is unlikely that there will be as many as in the rejected draft, but the number will be substantial. Second, the new constitutional text will be written by an elected body with the assistance of experts, constitutional scholars, sociologists, economists, and anthropologists. However, this time, the process will be guided by the political parties and will avoid the excesses and bureaucracy of the original convention. And third, the neoliberal era will not be revived. Most of the economic system built by the Chicago Boys will be replaced by a social democratic system like the one that prevails in the European and especially Nordic nations. Whether this deep change will help move the country toward social harmony, inclusiveness, greater equality, and prosperity is still an open question. Living the 2019 Revolt. On November 3, 2019, merely 2 weeks after the explosion of what Chileans call the revolt, I traveled to Chile. As soon as I arrived, I sensed a dramatic change relative to the last time I had visited, just 3 months earlier. Tension and anxiety were in the air. For 10 days I mingled with protesters and marched with them. I listened to their chants and had several one-on-one conversations with demonstrators of all ages. On several occasions, I had to run away from the police, who in full anti-riot gear charged against the crowds. To minimize the effects of tear gas, I covered my mouth and nose with a wet scarf. I tried to avoid the police water cannons, but I was not successful. One afternoon, I was soaked from head to toe, and my rather fancy clothes were ruined forever. When the police advanced, most demonstrators retreated as fast as they could, but a handful of members of the so-called front line stood their ground. They protected themselves with homemade shields, hurled Molotov cocktails, and used slings to throw rocks at the militarized police force, the carabineros. As night fell, they used laser beams to disorient the anti-riot cops. Many of these tactics were learned from demonstrators in Hong Kong. I saw young people being arrested and police beating up protesters. I saw looters running away from department stores and other businesses with TV sets, fancy sneakers, and even refrigerators. I saw burned metro stations and destroyed pharmacies and banks. To my surprise, many demonstrators chanted the fight songs of the most popular soccer teams in the country, Colo-Colo and La U, Club Universidad de Chile. One night I had trouble finding my hotel. As it turned out, the entrance had been boarded up, and guests, including a group of stunned Chinese tourists, had to come in through a garage at the side. There were graffiti everywhere. Neoliberalism was born and will die in Chile. No more Chicago Boys. Chile woke up. It's not 30 pesos in reference to the metro fare hike. It's 30 years of neoliberalism. The mood among the young protesters was extremely optimistic. Every demonstrator I talked to was convinced that the revolt would end the neoliberal model. To them, the future looked bright. Life would be much better under a system based on solidarity and equal opportunities. The revolt, including its violent manifestations, would result in the end of individualism, greed, and the profit motive. The patriarchal model would be replaced by a feminist perspective, and everyone would be treated with dignity. Neoliberal obsessions such as competition, efficiency, punctuality, and hyper-productivism would be replaced by nobler goals, including the pursuit of a better life. The rich would pay more taxes, education would be free and of high quality, and there would be universal and free health services. Everyone would enjoy the culture and the arts. Indigenous peoples would recover their ancestral lands, and the environment would be protected. The idea of a trade-off between economic growth and equality did not cross the protesters' minds. I also talked to business leaders and politicians, both conservative and left of center. They were stunned. They talked about a great paradox. While every traditional indicator showed that Chile was a major success and was steadily moving toward the ranks of the advanced nations, substantial portions of society were deeply unhappy and demanded major changes. The elites did not comprehend the reasons behind the revolt. Even those who had been critical of the model were surprised by the massiveness and violence of the protests. As it turned out, and as I discuss in Chapter 12, there had been plenty of warnings that economic success rested on a social powder keg of sorts. A small number of sociologists and political analysts pointed out in the early 2000s that a growing malaise was spreading through the population. This was referred to as the malestar, malaise, discomfort hypothesis. But those warnings were systematically ignored, and those who made them were treated as lunatics. Many conservatives were convinced that foreign militants were behind the revolt. They assured me that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and the Cuban government had sent thousands of activists to incite local anarchists and Antifa gangs. Conservatives could not accept that this was a homegrown protest movement. The fact that billionaire Sebastian Piñera, an economist by training and a strong supporter of the Chicago Boys, had been elected president less than 2 years earlier in December 2017 with 53% of the vote, added to the elite's incredulity. The day I left Santiago, I almost missed my flight. The main avenues and highways were blocked by protesters, barricades, and debris. The Uber driver tried different routes, only to run into more demonstrations. He was scared. At some point, he suggested that I go back to my hotel. "You are witnessing an insurrection," he said. Then he added, "the insurrection that will end the neoliberal model." I could not tell if he was against or in favor of the revolt, and I didn't ask. He told me that the car he was driving was his only asset, and he was afraid that it would be damaged by a rock or a Molotov cocktail. After I promised him a substantial tip, one commensurate with a neoliberal regime, he agreed to deliver me to the airport. That night, as the plane flew north over the Pacific Ocean, I decided to write an essay on the rise and fall of neoliberalism, using Chile's experience as an illustration. While in Santiago, I had taken copious notes, and I had written down a tentative outline. Once I was back in Los Angeles, I penned 3 short articles which were published in Vox EU, ProMarket, and the Milken Review. Although the pieces were well received, I had mixed feelings about them. They were too short and did not capture all the granularity of the story. They did not explain in sufficient detail how the U.S. State Department's version of Chile was conceived in the 1950s. Nor did they delve into how the thinking of specific University of Chicago faculty, Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, Arnold Al Harberger, and George Stigler, among others, had influenced the economic revolution put in place by their former students. One of the main points I made in those pieces was that to understand Chile's story, and thus the story of the rise and fall of neoliberalism, it was essential to go beyond income distribution and income inequalities. It was also necessary, I argued, to focus on horizontal inequality, or what philosopher Elizabeth Anderson has called relational inequality. It is not only about monetary income, but also about social interactions, segregation, racism, and the provision of amenities and public goods. And it is also about the way common people are treated by the elites. As it turned out, Chile did poorly in most of those areas. Many of the protesters I talked to mentioned achieving dignity as a key goal. Plaza Baquedano, the main square in Santiago where protests began every afternoon in the final months of 2019 and occurred every Friday in 2020-21, was unofficially renamed Plaza de la Dignidad, Dignity Square, by the demonstrators. What is neoliberalism? One of my greatest challenges in writing this book has been dealing with the terms neoliberal and neoliberalism. It is not because they are particularly difficult philosophical categories, but because with time they have become bastardized terms, derogatory labels tossed around by politicians, pundits of various types, and academics to diminish their adversaries and enemies. Nowadays, most of the media uses neoliberalism lightly, without trying to explain what is meant by it. This trend became particularly acute with the eruption of social media. Twitter is replete with short statements blaming neoliberals for almost every social, economic, environmental, and sanitary ill. A reader of the popular press or social media would not be at fault in concluding that almost every Western political leader in the last half-century was a neoliberal, and that most forms of capitalism and market-based economics systems are a manifestation of neoliberalism. Benjamin Wallace Wells of The New Yorker has asserted that Larry Summers is a neoliberal, and according to a June 21, 2021 article by Gary Gerstle in The Guardian, the neoliberal order dominated American politics for 40 years. The term neoliberal had its origins in the 1920s and 1930s, and gained some currency after the Colloque Lippmann, a meeting organized by French philosopher Louis Rougier and held in Paris in August 1938 to discuss the policy implications of Walter Lippmann's book, The Good Society. In this work, Lippmann argued that in order to preserve democracy and defeat authoritarian and collectivist regimes, it was necessary to rescue liberalism from the jaws of laissez-faire economic theory, a system that had created social distress, poverty, and acute inequality. The only way to defeat the likes of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin was by reforming capitalism and by adding social concerns to the profit motive. He argued that doing this did not constitute a betrayal of classical liberal principles. On the contrary, it meant going back to the views of thinkers such as Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham. The participants in the colloquium debated on what name to give the new movement. This renewed perspective about liberalism, this approach that incorporated social goals to the market system. After much discussion during the last day of the meeting, it was decided that neoliberalism was a succinct term that captured the concerns of the majority, but not all, of the participants. And so, the neoliberal movement was born on a summer day in 1938. For many years, the term neoliberalism was confined to academic discussions and writings. In the period immediately following World War II, it was mostly used to refer to German ordoliberalism, or the ideas behind the policies of Konrad Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard, the founders of the Federal Republic of Germany and the men behind its economic miracle. In 1951, Milton Friedman wrote a short piece titled Neoliberalism and Its Prospects. But as far as I have been able to ascertain, and I have looked everywhere and talked to most Friedman experts, he did not use the term again in his writings. In it, Friedman argued, along the lines of Walter Lippmann, that there was a need to move away from 19th-century laissez-faire economics and to develop institutions to protect consumers from exploitation by monopolies. In addition, the state would have the function of relieving misery and distress. It was not until the early 1990s that neoliberalism was used, mostly in the popular press and in non-academic policy writings, to denote market fundamentalism, or a doctrine that puts markets and the individuals above everything else, and is based on the belief that human behavior and social interactions are guided by greed, profits, and economic considerations. In the late 1990s, and especially in the United Kingdom and United States, the term neoliberalism came to be associated with a readiness to rely primarily on markets rather than on the state to achieve certain policy objectives, including improving social conditions. Several catchwords became associated with neoliberalism, including globalization, competition, balanced budgets, low inflation, deregulation, privatization, and homo economicus. In writing this book, I had to decide whether to use the term neoliberalism loosely, as it is currently used in the popular media, or to offer a narrow and precise definition, a characterization devoid of value content. Naturally, I opted for the latter. I define neoliberalism as a set of beliefs and policy recommendations that emphasize the use of market mechanisms to solve most of society's problems and needs, including the provision and allocation of social services such as education, old age pensions, health, support for the arts, and public transportation. Neoliberals believe that a purer form of capitalism, where markets are allowed to function in most...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?